Hi everyone, and welcome to Quilt Stories. I'm Lisa Walton, and today we're going to be talking to Margaret Abramshe from Utah, and she does really beautiful portrait type quilts, photographic images, but treats them differently. And I'm really looking forward to finding a bit more about how she achieves these wonderful images. So welcome, Margaret.
Well, thanks for having me, Lisa. I'm very excited to be talking to someone on the other side of the world who's having winter and not summer.
I'm just going to switch over to our screen of the quilt we're going to be talking about, which is Nan, and a photo of you with red hair.
Well, this photo, one of the reasons I selected this is, of course, I'm younger, but it's also a photo at the time that I started my journey to get to the quilt Nan. And it took me quite some time. This was when I was still teaching and I was living in Colorado, and I had two pieces of luck. The first piece of luck was I joined an art quilt group called Front Range Contemporary Quilters. And I got into that group, and I was a working art teacher, and I had a master's, and I painted and I did art and sold art, and I had never heard of an art quilt, and I thought, wow. And then I had a second piece of luck. In my critique group, there was some members of SAQA. In fact, one of them you just recently interviewed, Lee McComas. So I found my tribe, and I found something that I thought in the back of my mind, oh, wow, this is what I'm going to do.
I found my tribe with SAQA as well. And for those that don't know, SAQA is Studio Art Quilts Associate. All the details of the contacts to have a look at the website will be down below in the information section. So please go and check them out because it might be your tribe as well. And this is the start of your process.
It is. And what happened was, as many of us, when we retire, we sell the big family home. And so we sold our big family home in Colorado. And while I was unpacking, I discovered these boxes of photos. And I went, oh my, what a treasure trove. But I had never really jumped into portraits. But as soon as I saw this little treasure trove of photographs, I thought, this has really sparked a new journey. So when I retired, I really had the time to create something new in my life.
This next image is one of your quilts. I know when I originally spoke to you, you said, oh, I don't take progress shots. We're going to have a look at quite a few different quilts. Overall, it will give us the process that you use.
Okay, this quilt, like Lisa, all of my quilts are about story. There's something underneath the surface of that quilt that is speaking to me. From the time it starts as a little picture till when I print it out, I have this story. This is my Aunt Virginia Bell Lowers. She's this remarkable woman, and she was very much like a grandmother to me. My dad didn't marry until he was 50, and he was in Hawaii, and my mother decided on a whim in her mid 30s to move to Hawaii from Chicago. They met 3 months later, not years, months, they got married. And so my Aunt Virginia was the person who we saw like every Christmas. But she was born in Parkersburg, Virginia, and raised in a little town called Victor, Colorado. And her father, my grandfather, was a mining engineer. And this little girl was taken to kindergarten, and they said, oh no, she's too young. And she was 4 and just maybe a month shy of 5. And my grandmother said, well, okay. She took her home. She taught her to read. 4 weeks later, she brought her back and says, she's reading. Can you take her into school? And she graduated at 16, graduated from Stanford in 3 years. And she was a teacher. And that in the public school, which was, Stanford grads don't usually go to public school teaching, but she did. And she's the reason that I'm a teacher, and she's had a lot of influence on my life. And I just love this picture of her and her messy desk and her wonderful bathrobe. Now, she lived till 96, and we had to find her a home that had a cocktail hour and a smoking lounge. She was just a wonderful woman. And she told me, she only stayed in the home a few months. She says, Margie, I'm getting really, it's terrible. It's terrible. I'm losing it. I said, oh my gosh, Anthony, what's happened? I can't do the Sunday New York Times during coffee anymore. And I thought, oh my gosh, I can't do the Sunday New York Times. So that is the reason I think that my art speaks to other people, is because I think some way they feel that.
You work on the image and then you send it off to Spoonflower. Is this correct?
Yes. So my process is I do whole cloth quilts. And this quilt, obviously, at the time this picture was taken, which was somewhere in the 40s, it was black and white photographs. They were small. And so I take them not only into Photoshop, but I like to play with a lot of other programs. And the person who inspired me to do this is Jane Dunenwald. So I took her workshop at Tahoe. And when I was at that workshop, I just went, oh, what I now know. So what I do is I take my photograph and I treat it like underpainting. So the process of underpainting is that when you paint portraits or landscapes in a traditional form with oils or something, underneath the color, you establish the values. So a lot of paintings, if you had saw Da Vinci when he first started that painting, it would be just values. There would be no color. And they added color through a series of glazes. So, in a contemporary sense, what I am doing is I am creating the underpainting digitally, printing it on fabric. And then when I bring it into that studio of mine, I am using thin, thin, thin paint. Also, anything that I could put on a piece of watercolor paper or a canvas, I'll put on this, but in thin, thin layers, building up a kind of a glaze of color.
So the fabric that you get back is just in black and white shades of gray.
Shades of gray. I have ventured into color. At the beginning, I didn't, and I still prefer it to be gray. I like the color to be almost dull because I think that the visual impact of my work comes from the way that I paint the surface of that cloth. And this is the person who took most of those photographs. This is my Uncle Tom, and he's my father's brother. This is a wallet photo. It's not very big. And when I first adjust the contrast, I do something that's counterintuitive. I go into Photoshop and I actually convert it to black and white, even if it's already black and white. When you go into and Photoshop elements, when you go and you convert, it gives you different, it says newspaper and landscape and this and that. Well, all those are really, what do you want the contrast to be? And that's your key question. So after I've got the contrast that I'm intuitively thinking I like, then I'll apply some other elements of design. And in this case, I'm looking for maybe some surface texture. I might want to increase the line. So if you look on the right, I've got higher contrast, which makes those lines in the t-shirt pop out more. So when I'm going in there, I am looking to increase through the elements of design, through texture and value and line, and to make that a very interesting composition. And then I have absolutely, people ask me all the time, well, what materials do you use? Well, how many art catalogs are there? Because I will just try it. On the left, those are some acrylic markers in the little can that I took Betty Busby's workshop, but she and I have a similar attitude. is, as an artist, you're looking for the media, you're playing with it. Some things work for some of us, but don't work for others. I have this box of some other fabric markers, ink tents, which are very popular with art quilters. And I tend to treat the sticks like watercolor. I dip a brush in and watercolor over the top. And I'll take the pencils and I'll draw, and then I'll mist them lightly with water to get them to adhere. Because I didn't come from quilting, I have no attachment to whether you could wash this thing or not. And so now I do care about fading and other things, but I also know one thing, that a lot of people who are dipping their toes in art, they worship it a little bit. And I want them to think about something. Jackson Pollock used house paint. Robert Rauschenberg went to the trash and assembled stuff. And so archival qualities might be more important if you're someone like Gerhard Richter, who's selling his paintings for hundreds and thousands of dollars. But I think for most artists, it's what is working for you visually, what works in your composition. And that's my key.
So combination of different paints set with.
Yes. Now, those big bottles, and I'm a big believer in taking paint and putting it into another bottle, because the bottles they always give you are really cheap and they leak and they drip. And so I buy bottles and I fill them with different things. So on the yellow up there is liquid watercolors, and I mix them with acrylic paint or acrylic inks too. And what it does is that if you think about water, it thins it out, but it's that difference between transparent and opaque. And there's something between, ooh, this is like a stained glass window, and this is like paint on the wall. So I want to be able to manipulate that. The other trick I have, but recently I have not been afraid to use those really cheap dollar acrylics, because they come in all these ridiculous colors that sometimes you just need that little color, and instead of mixing it, you can just put in a drop or two of the cheaper colors, and it's exactly what you want. I also add that tall bottle there is gel medium, and that with water really helps the cheaper brands of acrylic do a better job.
We've got a close up here of Nan.
Let's talk a little bit about quilting and backgrounds, some of the visual elements that might make my work distinctive. Okay, the first thing is that background are inspired by Lucinda Day, and she was a graphic designer, worked after World War II and into the 50s and 60s, wonderful artist. But that picture was taken probably 62, 63. So there's something that, in terms of design, works, because historically it kind of works. The other thing that's working here is I've got a red orange and a yellow green. So those are colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel, and so they're complements. So they speak really well to each other. And then I have this really bright blue. And so the bright blue kind of makes you look, because it's sort of a surprise color. Yeah. Now the quilting, I look at quilting as if it is line that becomes a surface texture that becomes a pattern that lays on top of a painting. My quilting is really with the idea of that enhanced surface and the more interesting composition. And the other thing I wanted to point out here is the dress on this is black. It came out way darker, and actually so did the skin tones on this than I would have wanted. But sometimes you make a mistake. And you order something and it doesn't look good. It looks whatever. But isn't it interesting that the thing that started out like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do, actually challenged me as an artist to make something which is more exceptional. This is going into the Carnegie Center for the Arts, form not function, and it's one that really speaks to a lot of people. But it started out as a disaster.
Were the flowers on the dress, were they painted or discharged? They look discharged to me.
They aren't discharged. They actually didn't look much like flowers. So I had to paint them in white acrylic marker. And sometimes I put that white acrylic marker on there and let it sit for a day. And then I go over it with a tone, and so that it sort of starts to blend in. So I sharpen those a little bit, and it did help. But you can see that there's a couple of them that don't make sense, like on the collar. It's like it's bleeding over the collar, and that wouldn't have been how that happened. So I did fix that up a little, and mainly because I just didn't do a good job ordering that fabric.
Let's just go to the full quilt. So we'll just skip over any minor things like that.
And there's my mom. The background too, I like that off balance brick in the background. There's sort of it creates this illusion. One of the things with a portrait paint is that portraits often have a foreground figure and a background and no sort of middle ground, which can make them very stark. And so this one has something going on that creates that illusion of front, middle, and back. The red nails too is something I took from the Aunt Ginny portrait, where I did just a pop of that kind of glitzy red, which would have also been the go-to nail choice of that period. So it looks good. And it's funny too, because my mother wasn't much of a drinker. And so like I'm sure she held that pink lady or whatever for at least an hour and a half.
The wire work, that was your interpretation.
It's sort of a photo collage that I use. So I'll take inspiration pieces and I'll take them in. I can give a recommendation. The Pixel Ladies have a great course on Photoshop Elements, and you can pour in patterns into the background. You can also take those patterns and then alter them. It would be a mistake, and also probably a copyright violation if you simply took a piece of fabric that you liked and dumped it in the background. But more importantly, your audience would know.
What's happening here?
All right, so this is my latest quilt, and if you're on Instagram, you can, or I do also have a YouTube channel, you can see some of this. But this is a quilt that is a photo I took of a pair of jeans that my husband wore to Woodstock, a quilt that I acquired from family that's hung in the background. It's kind of a play on the idea of real and not real, fabric being photographed on fabric. And is it a fabric? Is it a painting? What is it? As well as a kind of a comment on history. So one of the things I do is I paint pretty much the whole surface, Lisa. Even if I change the tone, I change the value, I step back, I take a lot of photographs, I look at my color choices by changing the filter on my camera to black and white. So I really see those values, and that's very critical to take a look and see what you're doing. I also have a real love of these short, stiff acrylic paintbrushes, and I get real close and then I stand 5 feet away from it. So I'm constantly going back and forth during the painting process, just like a painter does with a blank canvas as they're building up the image. Okay, this is, and you and I are both in Sandra Sider's Creativity in the Midst of Chaos, I think it is.
Oh, yes.
But So this is me quilting that quilt Ghost Town. And I have a mid-arm. I have a HQ Sweet 16. I like that machine. People will say, well, what machine do you recommend? And I said, well, I can recommend a shop first and a machine second. Um, so I love that. Now, I happen to have an arthritic thumb, and maybe more of my fingers are getting arthritic. So I use these Martelli hoops. The hoops come whole, but my husband took a little saw and cut a slot in it so I can just slip it around the needle. I rest my hands on those knobs and I quilt, and ergonomically, it really has made a huge difference.
The links for all these products will be in the information section.
This is the quilt that started my big journey. This is the quilt that said to me, "Oh my gosh, I know what I'm doing." It's a picture of my grandfather, and this is again one of my first spoonflower prints. But the reason this quilt is also a breakthrough for me is I went to the SAQA conference in Portland, and at that conference, I met with a mentor, and she looked at my portfolio, which was very different at the time. She says, I don't really see a portfolio. You need something cohesive. You need something that will, you can present as a whole. And I went back from the conference and I said, I know what I need to do. And so this was my first quilt. It has a lot of good things going on that I give myself credit for having an art education background, because I've got the figure, which is actually dead center, which is no. The reason they call it dead center, Lisa, is because it's dead. If you put something in the center, unless it's a mandala, you got a problem. I threw that off by adding these, and also like the quilt of Nan, I've created a foreground, middle ground, and background, because to the left, those red oranges and yellow oranges and lights kind of overlap his shoulder and push him back a little bit. And then the gray and those lines coming down, they recede, they go farther back. The other thing that works with this is the fact that it is such a high contrast. And black is a dangerous color. I know a lot of people love black, but I know in my classroom for kids, I used to take all those little pads of black out of every watercolor set I ever bought, because there is no quicker way to ruin a composition than to inundate it with black. It's very powerful. But in this case, that black sets the figure solidly in the composition. And the fact that the lines, it's so graphic, and the contrast with the face, which is the center of interest, it really works as a composition. And it's a great quilt. And he is a favorite subject of mine. This is a picture of my husband's grandfather. They called him Paul, and this one is called Paul Bearer. He was an Italian immigrant. They were from Staten Island, and actually in this picture, the abstracted figures in the back, are really in the photograph, would be looking from the end of Staten Island across the ferry towards the city, almost where the Statue of Liberty would be. So it looks out at that New York City skyline. But in this case, Paul here is wearing the outfit that he would have worn to bury. He lost a son in World War II. His daughter lost a fiance in World War II. There was some loss that happened in those communities, but it would have also been the same outfit that one would wear to give your daughter away at a wedding. So it's just a wonderful portrait of an immigrant. And the other thing I like about this one is it's a little more playful. It came right after the portrait of my grandfather that we. So at this one, I was working with a more abstract background. I also added the little windows that are sewn have paper in them. They have rice paper and that's painted. So I was using all sorts of little things on this. Now the quilting on this one is good. It's kind of straight line quilting. Since that time, I'm much better at quilting. Let's just put it that way. So it was I did not know what I was doing, Lisa. I did not know what I was doing. So this quilt is one of those ones that I face the quilt because I wouldn't want anyone to see what's behind there.
Now we have a shot here of a new book that's coming out fairly soon.
I think it's already out.
Even better. So the details will be below. Both you and I have quilts in this book.
The quilt on this, though, happens to be mine. It's called Sky Lanterns. And this quilt is a pure digital collage. So in other words, I've taken imagery. Now, when you purchase images, like if you belong to, say you go to Getty, you can get permission for one of their images. But there's also all sorts of photo apps that have clouds you can pour in a background or light or whatever. And so this one, I have done this kind of digital collage with this quilt. And then the sky lanterns are done with silk organza. There's actually, on the whole quilt, there's 3 of them that drift away. And the little dots are created with wine corks. And I put a little paint on a wine cork and just spotted this around. But this is also the idea of creating a visual pathway in your quilt so that the viewer is led through that composition and out into somewhere else. And the way I got the idea from this quilt is I happened to see some sky lanterns going off on the desert because I live in the desert. In Asian culture, they send these off over the ocean. But I also thought, someday when I die, I would love my children to take my ashes and send off a bunch of sky lanterns over the desert and just let them flow off. So, but I'm really proud to see that on that book, and I ordered it, and I hope everyone else will.
That was amazing. I've loved your quilts for a long time, and to see how they're made is very incredible. And I'm very, very inspired, and I hope our viewers are as well. I would like to thank you so much, Margaret, for spending some time with me today. I'm hoping that if you've enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more, there's a subscribe button in the bottom corner.
I subscribe and I've shared it on my social media, and I'll share it on my social media.
I know, and I'm really grateful. The word is getting out, and I'm just getting some really lovely letters of appreciation as well, which really makes my heart feel very warm. Thanks to Margaret. Thanks to all of you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you all again next time. So bye, Margaret.
Thank you, Lisa.
Bye for now.